Nobody in Tallis County, Washington thought much of it when 68-year-old Arlo Sennett retired from 31 years delivering mail along the county's rural routes and started spending his mornings instead walking the same roads with a pair of binoculars and a small spiral notebook. Retired men took up hobbies. Bird watching was a perfectly ordinary one. What raised eyebrows slowly over the better part of a decade was how relentlessly Arlo kept at it, walking the same 11-mile loop through orchard country nearly every morning for years, counting, in exact tallies, every species and every individual bird he saw at each fixed point along the route. His son-in-law joked at a family dinner one Thanksgiving that Arlo had traded a working pension for a very expensive way to watch chickadees. The joke got a laugh. It also, more or less, became the way most of Tallis County talked about Arlo's bird counts for years afterward, a harmless, faintly comic use of a retired man's time that nobody thought had anything to do with the county's actual livelihood, the tens of thousands of acres of apple orchards that had supported Tallis County families for 4 generations. They were wrong, and it would take a pest outbreak that threatened to wipe out a season's harvest across the entire valley before anyone understood exactly how wrong. If stories about patience, quiet dedication, and the surprising value of paying attention to something for its own sake matter to you, this is exactly the kind of story we tell every week. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moves you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find the people who care about stories like Arlo's. Now let's find out what those years of bird counts were really tracking, and why an entire county would eventually need them. Tallis County sits in the apple-growing country of central Washington, dry, sun-baked hills cut through with irrigated orchard rows that turned the valley floor a deep, uniform green through the growing season. Apples were Tallis County's economy in a way few outsiders fully appreciated. The industry supporting packing houses, cold storage warehouses, and a seasonal labor economy that touched nearly every family in the county in one way or another. Arlo had spent his working life delivering mail along the same rural route, 11 miles of orchard roads connecting a scattering of family farms, packing sheds, and small homesteads on the valley's eastern slope. He'd been a quiet, observant man his whole career, the kind of mail carrier who noticed which mailboxes needed repair before anyone asked, and which elderly customers hadn't collected their mail in a worrying number of days. His wife, Doreen, had passed away 6 years before his retirement, and their daughter, Kimberly, lived 2 hours away with her own family, close enough for regular visits but far enough that Arlo's days, once his route ended, stretched out long and mostly empty. He'd always noticed birds along his route, the way anyone who spends 30 years driving the same rural roads eventually starts noticing the small, recurring details of a landscape. But it was only after retirement, with time on his hands and, as Kimberly put it gently more than once, maybe a little too much quiet, that Arlo turned that casual noticing into something structured. He bought a decent pair of binoculars, borrowed a field guide from the county library that he eventually just kept, and began walking his old mail route on foot, stopping at 11 fixed points he chose deliberately, spaced roughly a mile apart, to count and record every bird he could identify every morning in every season, for as long as his knees would carry him. The habit held for longer than even Arlo expected of himself. 2 years passed, then 5, then 8, his notebooks filling one after another, each labeled by year and stored in a cardboard box in his hall closet that grew heavier every winter. He kept meticulous records, species, counts, weather conditions, the specific location of each sighting relative to his 11 fixed points, a level of consistency that would have impressed a professional field biologist, though for most of those years nobody with any professional interest ever thought to ask. His neighbor, Dean Okafor, who ran 200 acres of honeycrisp and gala trees along the same stretch of road Arlo's old route had covered, mentioned to another grower at the packing house one autumn that Arlo Sennett walked past his orchard every single morning with binoculars, rain or shine, and had been doing it so long that Dean's dog no longer bothered barking at him. "Man's got the most expensive bird hobby in the county," Dean said, not unkindly, the kind of comment that got repeated and softened into a running, affectionate joke around Tallis County for years. Kimberly worried, quietly, that her father had replaced one long solitary route with another, though she never said so directly, and Arlo, for his part, never explained the habit as anything more complicated than something to do with his mornings. What Arlo had actually been tracking, without any formal training or any real audience for most of a decade, was a slow, steady decline in several specific bird species along his route, particularly the small insect-eating birds, chickadees, nuthatches, and several species of native sparrow that had once been common in the older, less intensively managed orchard sections along the valley's eastern slope. His notebooks showed counts of black-capped chickadees, for instance, that had dropped by more than half over 9 years at several of his fixed points, a decline he'd noticed happening gradually enough that no single year's numbers looked alarming on their own, but that became impossible to miss once he compared his earliest notebooks against his most recent ones. He mentioned the decline to Dean once, almost in passing, over a fence-line conversation about nothing in particular. Dean, more focused on spray schedules and market prices than bird populations, didn't think much of it at the time, though he'd remember the conversation clearly enough a year and a half later. The trouble started in earnest the following spring, when Tallis County growers began reporting codling moth populations at levels nobody in the valley had seen in over a decade. Codling moth, the small, persistent pest responsible for the classic wormy apple, overwinters as larvae tucked into bark crevices and structural cracks in orchard trees, emerging in spring to lay eggs that, left unmanaged, could ruin a significant share of a season's fruit. Growers across the valley had always managed codling moth through a combination of pheromone traps, carefully timed spraying, and, though few growers had ever thought to credit it explicitly, a long-standing population of insect-eating birds that picked overwintering larvae out of bark crevices through the winter months, quietly suppressing pest numbers before spring emergence ever became a serious problem. That particular winter had been unusually mild, ideal conditions for codling moth survival, and growers across the valley found themselves facing an infestation that standard spray schedules alone weren't fully containing. By late spring, Washington State University's Regional Extension Office had gotten involved, sending an entomologist named Dr. Priya Anand to assess the outbreak and help growers develop an emergency management plan before the pest population could establish itself deeply enough to threaten multiple seasons of harvest rather than just one. Dr. Anand's early assessment found something that puzzled her initially. The infestation wasn't uniform across the valley. Orchards on the county's western side, more intensively managed, more uniformly planted, cleared of the old hedgerows and scattered older trees that growers had spent decades removing in favor of efficient, dense modern rows, showed codling moth damage significantly worse than orchards on the eastern slope, where a handful of growers, Dean Okafor's operation among them, had kept older trees, hedgerow borders, and scattered wild plantings along their property lines mostly out of habit rather than any deliberate conservation strategy. Dr. Anand couldn't fully explain the pattern from her survey data alone, and it was Dean, remembering that fence line conversation from the year before, who suggested she talk to Arlo Sennett. Arlo brought out his full cardboard box of notebooks when Dr. Anand visited that June, 9 years of consistent, dated bird counts from 11 fixed points scattered precisely along the exact stretch of orchard country now showing the sharpest divide in codling moth damage. Dr. Anand spent nearly 2 full days working through his data with him, and by the time she finished, her assessment had shifted from puzzled interest to something closer to genuine excitement. Arlo's notebooks showed, with a level of consistency that professional citizen science bird surveys rarely achieved, that the insect-eating bird populations that had declined most sharply over his 9 years of counting were concentrated almost exactly in the western orchard sections now suffering the worst codling moth damage, while the eastern sections, where older trees and hedgerows had survived, retained noticeably healthier populations of the same species and showed measurably lower pest pressure. Dr. Anand explained to a packed meeting at the county extension office that August what Arlo's data had helped her confirm. Insect-eating birds, particularly the chickadees and nuthatches Arlo had tracked so carefully, provided a meaningful and previously undercredited layer of natural codling moth suppression by foraging overwintering larvae out of bark crevices through the winter months, a service that growers had been quietly losing for years as orchard modernization removed the older trees, dead wood, and hedgerow habitat those birds depended on for nesting and shelter, without anyone connecting the dots until a bad winter finally exposed how much that lost natural pest control had actually been worth. The immediate emergency required conventional spray intervention regardless, and growers across the valley spent that summer managing the outbreak with the tools they had. But the longer-term response, developed with Dr. Anand and rolled out the following autumn, drew directly on what Arlo's years of patient counting had revealed. The Extension Office launched a valley-wide nest box program targeting exactly the species Arlo's notebooks had tracked, encouraging growers to preserve remaining hedgerow sections and install habitat features designed specifically to rebuild the insect-eating bird populations his data showed had quietly disappeared. Dean Okafor, whose own orchard's older sections had inadvertently protected his crop through the worst of the outbreak, became one of the program's earliest and most vocal supporters, telling anyone who'd listen at the packing house that the county owed its recovery plan to the postman and his birds. A phrase that stuck around Tallis County with considerably more warmth than the earlier jokes about wasted pensions ever had. Arlo never made much of what happened that year. When people asked how he'd known something was changing, he usually gave some version of the same simple answer. He hadn't known anything, not with certainty, not for years. He'd simply wanted a reason to keep walking his old route every morning, and counting birds had given him one. Faithfully enough and long enough that the numbers eventually told him something worth knowing, whether he'd set out to learn it or not. There's a particular kind of value that only patient, sustained attention can produce, the kind that no single season of observation could ever have revealed on its own. Arlo Sennett hadn't set out to protect Tallis County's apple harvest or teach a university entomologist anything about orchard ecology. He'd simply refused to let a quiet retirement pass without paying close attention to something, morning after morning, for nearly a decade, and in doing exactly that, faithfully and without any real audience for most of those years, he built the one record that finally explained why an entire valley's oldest, least modernized orchards had quietly been protecting themselves the whole time.